today. That is William Heathershaw, and actually he's here with his wife, Anne. Welcome. And he's going to be talking about something that I feel is very interesting in his life. Today, despite growing up in a lower middle-class situation, William is blessed that he's been provided the opportunities to experience so much in life, including traveling to nearly 40 countries on 4 continents. Have you been to Antarctica?
No.
Oh, well, you got somewhere to go yet. He spent most of the past 8 years focusing on his own small businesses, though he decided to join recently a decades-old family-owned business in Plymouth within the business technologies industry. Their primary offerings are business telecommunications and an emergency management platform for school districts, college campuses, governments, healthcare systems, and large venues. William is also dedicated to promoting the scholarships offered by the Horatio Alger Association, one of the largest private funders of needs-based scholarships. They changed his life in 2004 when he was one of 2 recipients that year in Iowa for a national scholarship. Congratulations. William and his wife of 5 years, Anne, have a beautiful and spunky toddler. I think some of us have seen that toddler. Josie, who somehow simultaneously drains and recharges them. William will talk to us today about his years living in Beijing, China, and how that has affected his life. Please welcome William Heathershaw.
I intend for this to be a pretty casual sort of thing, a conversation even. So if you have questions while we're going through this. But yeah, so during the 4 years when I was living in China, I'd come back on average of once a year, usually around Christmas time, though I guess I did miss the first Christmas. But friends and family, they would say, "Oh, how's China?" And after living there for 10 months at a time, as you can imagine, all the things going on a day-to-day basis, like how do you answer that question? So similarly, my life in China over a 4-year period, how do I even talk about that? And so kind of to help get things going, I just went through a bunch of photos, and I chose like 20 or so photos, and each one has a little bit of a story or at least some sort of perspective on my experience. But again, if you have any questions or input throughout, and I'll try to have this be done maybe 5-10 minutes early, potentially. This is all kind of fluff stuff, by the way, it's just my personal experiences. But if you want to talk about society or business or politics or culture, we can certainly do that at the end of this presentation. So yeah, this was this Iowa boy who had not seen anything in the world, and his dad and younger brother took him to the airport in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, to join fellow volunteers of mine. So I think there were 20 or so University of Iowa students who would go to Beijing to volunteer for the 2008 Olympics. And I was very blessed to have that opportunity. I can get into the story of how that all came about, but so after that long flight, if you're curious what I thought and how I felt and what my first impressions were, so Xinhua is the like the AP, Associated Press in China. Of course, it's state-run over there. But they met us at the airport when we landed because we were the first group of international volunteers for the Olympics. So they wanted to know, our impressions. And apparently, I said, "I'm so glad I'm here." When we landed, I was like, "Wow, I'm in Beijing."
Do you remember saying that?
I probably said something like that. But of course, this, being state-run media, they wanted to show how impressed and how excited and how all these different things are for us as visitors and as volunteers. But certainly I will say, grew up in Iowa, China is such a foreign concept. We kind of joke about you dig in the ground, and the other side of the world is China. And I looked that up, actually, I think from Iowa, it's Argentina or something like that. But, or I'm sorry, maybe you have to be in Argentina to dig a hole to get to China. One of the two. So, you know, pretty mind-boggling experience the first couple of weeks in China. Again, because we were these international volunteers, we had some media attention, and so I think a lot of these folks in this picture actually were just strangers. I think if you yourself have gone to China, or if you have friends who have gone to China, you probably know that you might stand out, especially in tourism areas. Because in Beijing and Shanghai and some of those larger cities, there's so many foreigners living there nowadays that you don't really stand out. People don't really take a second look at you. However, these tourism areas, they attract Chinese from all around the country, from the villages and whatnot. So for them, visiting these sites, they may never have seen a white person before, or a person of color before. And so, yeah, here's an image of a bunch of folks joining us for a video thing here. So as a volunteer, yeah, I got some sweet swag, and Ann said I should not wear it today, but I wore it. It still fits. So such an incredible experience volunteering in the International Broadcast Center. So each Olympics, they have like a framework that they just copy in all the different cities every 4 years, every 2 years. And each Olympics has the International Broadcast Center, where NBC Studios sets up. They have whoever, Lester Holt or whoever, broadcasts from there. And so I got to sit at the front desk and answer questions about the building, about the grounds, by essentially non-Chinese who needed help around. And I guess I need to recreate that pose. So, do you remember these venues, by the way? Do you remember the Olympics from, so it's the Bird's Nest, and I was very spoiled, right? So as you can see behind me, in front of the Bird's Nest, there's nobody there. That's because it's a secured area, and I had the credentials to get in. And so this could have been a couple days before the opening ceremonies. But very spoiled to have such a crazy experience. So I'm just going to go into a couple things you might ask in general. Did you have a bicycle? Did you have a scooter or a moped? I actually finally got one maybe 3 months before I left. And so mostly the subway and walked. I mean, I was the skinniest I'd ever been, because you'd walk miles and miles a day just to get around. Subway. Did I like the food? Oh yeah, look at that expression, I love the food. And seriously, I mean, like, in a city like Beijing, you could live like a prince and like spend a ton of money on anything and everything, or you can live like a pauper, and this meal probably cost, a few dollars, with multiple dishes, multiple beers. And so I definitely loved eating at like the neighborhood little holes in the wall that are family run, and the family, they're there the entire day long. And often you get questions about, oh, I hear you can eat all these random things. Well, sure, I'm kind of curious who here has been to China? So Julie, Peggy, do you remember going to a street like this in Beijing? It's like a snack street where they sell these random, like cicadas and whatever. So maybe everything was this back in the 90s, I don't know. Holy cows. Well, at least nowadays it's a novelty and it's just a fun thing. So, and then another question that everybody loved to ask me, yes, this is kind of what toilets looked like, especially back in the 80s and 90s. I mean, the apartments I lived in had Western style toilets. But when I first went, I stayed at Tsinghua University. So I stayed in the dorms, and yeah, I mean, this is kind of what my first several months was like. Well, it wasn't like the crapper. I'm saying this is what I had to get used to using in the first few months. So I never thought the idea of when you're living overseas as an international student, or I guess an expat, it's not necessarily you in a sea of local national people. You're more than likely to spend a lot of your time with other international students, other expats. And so this is a picture from my 23rd birthday at Shenzhen University. So after Beijing for the Olympics, I went down to Shenzhen, which is nearby Hong Kong. and studied one last semester. Didn't really matter credit-wise because I'd already graduated. But at my 23rd birthday, I think there was 20 or so different nationalities that were present, and I think here is maybe 5 or 6. So being a guy from Iowa, to then, a couple months later be thrown into this, pretty cool. While I was in Shenzhen as a student, it's like, oh, I can't remember how this came about, but they're like, oh, you're an American guy, cool, do you want to make $25 an hour? Like 5 to 10 hours a week? Okay. So hopefully I taught them. I tried to teach them English. They were a rambunctious little bunch, but there's just some second grade students that I taught for, I don't remember if it was like a month or 6 weeks, something like that. And speaking of Shenzhen, I never realized, in my mind, China was always the manufacturing capital of the world. But then you think of, is there somewhere in China that's like the manufacturing capital of China? And the answer probably is Shenzhen, in that area. And so, yeah, this is just a picture of, I don't know how many go through that Shenzhen port every day, but more than likely this was on the way to the US, to Long Beach, our largest port. So one kind of interesting story, like, is anybody here really into like the EV, the electrical vehicle industry? Like, are you familiar with BYD? So Brian is. And so BYD today, 2024, is the largest EV brand manufacturer in the world. And this was back in 2008, was it 16 years ago?
Yeah.
So what was I doing hanging out at this BYD thing? And so throughout my college career, I was very fortunate to be an intern for a company called Mid-American Energy. And they were owned by Berkshire Hathaway. So that's Warren Buffett's company. So I spent 4 years with them. And then I moved, to Shenzhen. And then one day in the English newspaper, the Shenzhen Daily, it talked about how Warren Buffett had invested, I can't remember how much, into BYD. And I'm like, hold on, is this what I'm supposed to do with my life right now? I was with Mid-American Energy for 4 years, which is owned by Berkshire Hathaway. Moved to Shenzhen. There on the front page, Berkshire makes this investment in BYD, which is Shenzhen based. And so I tried to kind of network a little bit with BYD locally there. Tried to connect a little bit with, the Mid-American folks back in the U.S. to say, hey, you're making this huge investment. You need to hire me to be your go-in-between. And actually, the guy in charge of the investment took my phone call, and we scheduled like 15 minutes. And then within the first 2 minutes, he was like, yeah, the investment isn't really big enough to have somebody solely dedicated to this. But he still gave me 13 minutes we talked about. That was so cool. That was, yeah. So anyway, that's kind of like an interesting little story early in my career, and I thought that would have been my trajectory. So after Shenzhen, moved back to Beijing, and because of my experience with the international media, I was hired by a friend of a friend. That's how a lot of that stuff happens in China. You don't really apply to jobs. It's usually, who do you know? And a friend of a friend introduced me to the International Finance Forum, and they thought, oh, hey, if this guy has all these connections with the international media, we want to become more famous. We want to be the Davos of the East, and we want you to help us build that brand internationally. So what they didn't understand, though, they hired me in let's say it's in May, and they're going to have this big event in August. And they said, okay, we want the Wall Street Journal, we want the Financial Times, we want all these different guys there. And so I was there for a month or 2 months, and they said, okay, who do you have signed up? And I'm like, nobody. And they're like, well, what do you mean? I'm like, you don't know who the speakers are going to be. You don't know what they're going to talk about. And they're like, well, we already have all this Chinese media signed up. And I'm like, yes, that's how things work differently in our cultures. But don't worry, I'm building relationships with them right now. I'm taking them out for coffee. And then I was fired after my first 2 months because it was. But one thing I got out of it was I got to attend this huge event at the Great Hall of the People. This is where the Chinese Congress meets, and there was a conference that I was invited to participate in this building that not that many people get into. And so that was. This is being recorded.
Yep.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
Okay.
Should I not? Oh, sorry.
No, I'm joking. That's,
Okay.
that's fine. I was a tourist there. I wasn't working with the government or anything like that. Okay. So after I was fired maliciously because they had unrealistic expectations about media, I started my own business, I guess my first business at this time. And the whole concept here was if you were a Chinese person or an American and you wanted to shop from US websites at that time, they didn't really ship to China, nor if you're a Chinese person and only had like a Chinese form of payment, you couldn't use it to shop on a US website. But also the need for like US products definitely increased a lot because of just how important brand is to Chinese. So I made the solution for that. And so here's just a picture of me and a friend of mine at the International School of Beijing promoting to parents and families that were at the school. I think I worked on that for like a year and a half or so and decided to wind it down after we got a lot of Americans to use it, but every time we introduce it to Chinese, they would say, oh, are you familiar with Taobao or Alibaba? So it's kind of like the eBay of China. And of course, I'd go to this thing where you can't really trust what you get on there, but you know it's the real thing, so you're shopping. Anyway, there wasn't enough traction to keep it going. One of my favorite memories of living in China is just the concept of, eating from street vendors, especially when it comes to kebabs, or chuar is kind of what we call it. And so this is me hanging out with a friend of a friend during a trip to Shanghai. And coincidentally, I learned maybe like a year or so after this, the kid on the right is the nephew of the founder of BYD, that company. So that was, in my head too. I'm like, okay, hold on, now Eric can, anyway, that was one of my first ideas I tried to materialize, but nothing came of that. Another thing I did when I was there was, so I'm from Waterloo, Iowa, and next to Waterloo is Cedar Falls, which is where the University of Northern Iowa is. And a good friend of mine heads up the international admissions, and so she would come to China, and she's like, oh, it's such a pain making this trip, and I'm not as flexible, I don't really like to deal with things that are unexpected. I'm like, well, hey, I'm here, so if you need me to help go to conferences and recruitment fairs and that sort of thing, I'm happy to do it. So I ended up doing that and helping out, for maybe a year or two on a part-time basis. So I guess I'm talking to, or posing here with not a recruiting firm, but they set up a lot of these firms in China that would help introduce Chinese students to Western schools, and they would help them apply. And so it's like, I don't want to call it a racket, but you pay them thousands of dollars to help you learn about what schools and to go through that whole process. And sometimes their tactics, I think, are a little unsavory because of how they help with applications and whatnot. But anyway, one thing I did for multiple years was I hosted a monthly networking event. It's actually defunct now, but it was called Oriented, the idea of Orient. And it'd have the same night each month in major cities across Asia, they would have this event. So it's kind of designed for folks that do business in Asia. So no matter what city you're in, if you're there that night of the month, you know where to go and a good chance to meet with people. So I guess I'm not really dressed as well as I thought. Kind of shabby there. I think the belt is too, anyway. I never cared about my looks until I got married, and there's a certain standard now I need to uphold. Let's see. Trying to think of the timeline of my life. So eventually that business I started, I wound it down because I met this company called Wimdu, and they actually were a super early competitor to Airbnb. So Airbnb just raised their Series A funding. So they were like this burgeoning Silicon Valley startup company that these guys in Germany said, hey, we need to copy them internationally. And then we need to make that a successful business and then sell it back to Airbnb. And so I worked for their Beijing office to kind of get that going. But at the time there was the Beijing office plus maybe 20 or 30 other cities around the world. And but yeah, so you can see this skyscraper, I guess, downtown in the Central Business District. And you can see on that day what the fog situation was like. But here today it's much better. But during those days, it was still iffy. This is kind of a fun thing. So back to the media. So in China, it's all state-run, and the primary news media is CCTV, which is the Chinese, I forget what it stands for, China Central Television, perhaps. And their channels, it's like CCTV, CCTV2, CCTV3. And anyway, the company I was working for was developing a mobile app for CCTV. And I was kind of like the project manager for that. So they're like, oh, here, let's just show our audience, probably millions of people, that we have this new app and you can show us how it works and stuff. So here's kind of a video of that, or a picture of that. And then that company that developed the app, these are some of my coworkers there. And I just want to give a couple of shout outs to, nobody here, right? But the gentleman on the far right, he did his EMBA at the University of Iowa. So in preparation to go into China, I talked to the director of the EMBA program, saying, hey, I'm doing this China thing. Who should I connect with? He said, oh yeah, you should meet with Alan. So he was a great guy. Then he introduced me to his college friend or high school friend, Claudia. And it became both very important in my life. And Claudia even sent us like a very nice wedding gift. She couldn't make it to the wedding, but and then last year, some other really great friends, Mike Peters, there was a shout out to him. He passed away in China, I think like 5 years ago. Incredibly great guy. Like I'll always remember one night he and I were out at the bar, and he got pickpocketed. His camera was taken from his jacket, and he knew it. He saw what happened, and these guys were walking out the door. I approached the guys and say, "Hey, what's going on? Give the camera back, things like that." I think they wanted to fight. But Mike the entire time was like, "No, just don't worry about it. It's just a camera. Forget it." I'm like, "Dude, don't let these guys like roll over you like that." Because he was such like a soft, kind guy. But anyway, I'll always remember his kindness and his friendship. And it just happened that he came down with cancer while living in Beijing, and I don't think he had the right medical care. But it's sometimes an issue, especially when you're in other countries and you can't really advocate for yourself if you're not tied in super well. But I just want to have that be the last slide to give a shout out to Mike. And that's the end of the formal presentation. What questions or comments do you all have? Brian?
Yeah, I noticed that one of your last groups you were working with was at a Sikh. He had a turban.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, he was a coworker and became a roommate, and that's right, yeah. Now, he had a tough time living in Beijing as far as diet. Like, he was a vegetarian and pretty much a vegan, practically. And so he ate a lot of French fries, a lot of, But he lived there, I think, longer than I did, so, shut.
You got a picture of Claudia and Alan.
Yeah.
I have a feeling those probably weren't their Chinese names. So is there a culture where, is there, not an expectation, but is there a culture there where people get to choose westernized names? How's that work?
Yeah, I think some people like to choose a Western name based on phonetics of their Chinese name, and others just make it up based on, oh, I love this character in this movie. But there's no other culture attached to it than, maybe based on phonetics or, one of my good buddies, his name is Snake, because Snake is a character in a video game that he loves.
But you didn't choose a Chinese name.
Well, so when I was studying Chinese at Iowa for a couple semesters, the teacher gave us names. So my name is He Wei Li. And it means like He is kind of like the Heathershaw. And Wei Li, I said I wanted something powerful and something. So I guess it means like power and profits, like money profits.
Manifesting.
Did you notice any cultural shifts or big changes that went on in China over the years that you were there?
I don't know if I noticed over those 4 years major cultural shifts. I do know, things are different today because I left in 12, and so now it's 12 years later. And I think, so for me and for a lot of Western people, if you wanted to be there, it'd be relatively easy to be there when it comes to a visa and enforcement of visas and that sort of thing. But now I think it's a lot stricter to even get like a visa, and I think the enforcement is a lot stricter. Part of it's geopolitical issues. Another part is they're a very pragmatic sort of government and culture in many ways, where it was very open to Westerners when it was time to bring your businesses and open up your offices and and train people and transfer technology and things like that. But after a while, it's like we're pretty good. All of our residents, we're going to U.S. Universities now, so a lot of our Chinese now actually speak English very, very well. They're Western educated, and so I think the need for you is a little bit less.
Yeah. Can we give him a round of applause? I'm sure there'll be some more questions. I know I've got a couple more.
All right.
But really, really well done.